People often ask me about extremely low budget esports PCs similar to that SFF PC I did a while ago, but people keep asking me to do it with about half the budget, with this £30 PC. So firstly, to actually start this build we need a basis of something to work with, and this is where the motherboard and CPU come into question. I bought a standard OEM LGA 775 motherboard which came with a Core 2 quad included. Now, this type of bundle is extremely common over on eBay if you use auctions, with them usually selling around the £12/$15 mark, especially if you keep your eye on some of the good ones which are mislisted and things like that. It came with an Intel Q8200, which is fairly mediocre by today's standards, but is also very easy to get cheap if you need to get it standalone, as I've seen these things sell for about sub £6, and the same as that in dollars. Realistically, the performance isn't brilliant, but with this price point we're working with, there's not much else we can do. To pair with this though, I got hold of some DDR2, which I managed to snag 6 gigs for £5.20, which is definitely a usable amount, but this is some very low quality stuff, which is only clocking in at 667 MHz. It's not bad, but it does mean that we'll be running with low speed RAM, which can affect the quality of a Core 2 quad, although realistically the performance deficit between 800 MHz, which is the common stuff, and 667 MHz isn't actually that much, especially in a PC with this low budget. Realistically, 6 gigs is the optimal amount for a PC with this kind of budget, as 4 gigs really isn't going to cut it, and I found 8 gigs would cost ever so slightly too much, but is definitely an option I'll look into in the future. Graphically, we have the GTX260, as originally I was going to opt for an older Radeon card, but even then I went ahead and picked up both, with the Radeon HD 4850 and both the GTX260 costing me about £8 each, which is about common for these older GPUs as they seem to be found everywhere, and most people are trying to get rid of them due to their lack of DX11 support. Realistically though, the drivers on either side are somewhat okay, with the Radeon really needing modded drivers. Although the Nvidia stock drivers aren't spectacular, they will get by with most esports titles. The case was just a locally bought pile of junk which cost me about £5 and is made by the company CIT. It didn't feel very sturdy and was probably comparable to a piece of jelly, and it looks alright, but realistically a small breeze would be capable of making a dent in this little thing. These old cases are everywhere, you can just look locally and pick one up cheap. Amazon Warehouse has tons of cases, eBay's got loads of cases, and realistically I was going to stick these in an old beige case before I saw this deal locally. It looks slightly classier, but realistically these parts aren't exactly going to chuck out much heat, so it doesn't really matter what case you go with. The hard drive was fairly standard, costing me £5 from CEX, and realistically you can actually get these cheaper if you check your local boot fair and things like that, because we're not going to be storing much other than a few games and applications, and 500GB is more than manageable. You have to make sure that the hard disk drive isn't too damaged, as I've definitely been knocked out on a few of those, because realistically some people try and throw away the ones that don't have much life left in them. This one here is alright, and realistically considering how cheap SSDs are, you might be able to chuck in one of those at some point. The power supply I originally opted for was a cheap £7 FSP Group one, which works fine with these parts and is available everywhere, but going through some eBay auctions I managed to snag this OCZ power supply for £3. I mean, both of them are absolutely fine, and realistically you shouldn't cheap out on your power supply, so do opt for a nice FSP or Delta if you can't find a branded one, as I will never recommend a dodgy Chinese one when FSP, Delta and good brands are available cheap on eBay, as I'd take a good second-hand one over some dodgy Chinese new one that can't put out enough power to bloody power an LED. That is of course without catching fire, but realistically just don't touch those. So why don't we get round to adding all these parts together, sticking the CPU and RAM all in the motherboard and putting these all into the case, which is something fairly easy to do, and seeing just how well this type of build holds up in 2018. After that was done, I decided to set up the PC, stick on Windows 7, and even decide to use an authentic 900p monitor that most people will probably end up using with this type of PC, as realistically we're going to be testing the 720p to 900p resolutions anyway, so I might as well try and make the experience you see on screen as accurate as possible. So why don't we find out just how well this £38 PC holds up in 2018, and if it's really worth your money. So first up on our benchmarks isn't really an esports title, but it's to set the stage as it's a good first title to test, so I fired up GTA 5, which I found to run very nicely in the 720p resolution, with a mixture of low and medium options, as this is what worked best. Keep in mind that we were mostly CPU limited by that Q8300 here, and not much else could be changed because of this. Although if you do look at the graph, you can see that you can up the game to full 900p if you don't mind a little bit of instability, but then again, I'd recommend 720p with a mixture of low and medium, as then you get a nice mixture of stability and graphical settings. Dropping the resolution or settings down further than this, or even just going down to low in 720p, didn't make much difference due to how much we were already limited by that CPU, but overall it was a decent and playable experience. Next up is something that's extremely popular and does still support DirectX 10, unlike its counterpart PUBG. We have Fortnite here running in 720p with the low option selected and the view distance set to medium, as far options were a little bit too intensive for this little PC to run, and I found that the medium settings didn't look too bad and allowed us parity between the CPU and GPU, which offered a fairly decent experience overall with 44 FPS on average, which I found to be much more playable than if we increased the resolution up to 900p, which was alright, but generally ran much closer to that 30 FPS mark, which just wasn't smooth at all for a competitive game. But in 720p I found frame drops to be less frequent, and I also found the game to be a much more pleasant experience overall. Definitely playable, but not ideal really. I found CSGO to run absolutely lovely in the 900p resolution with the low option selected and then shadows set to high, which is how a lot of people I've spoken to actually end up playing the game. It was very smooth with 75 FPS on average and decent frame times too, although dying could cause momentary dips as reflected by the 1% lows. I'd also add that I did test the 4x3 resolution of 1024x768 with the exact same settings, and we didn't really see much of an increase in performance due to how the CPU was actually a limit, but it's alright overall, so realistically it's more preference if you want 16x9 or 4x3. Either way, it doesn't matter what you tweak around as you are already CPU limited. Rocket League and other simpler titles run absolutely fine when using the high settings in the 900p resolution. In fact, I'd even say most smaller indie games would suit the 1080p resolution if you wanted to, as originally I did start with medium options in the 900p resolution, but the performance was just so good that I ended up increasing it and we easily stayed above 60 FPS in Rocket League and some similar titles which I didn't actually bother to benchmark, but you get the idea. Indie titles like this will definitely run well, so definitely a good example of how newer indie games will run, and a nice testament to what the PC can actually do in terms of modern-ish gaming, but on the non-AAA side of things. Next up I tested a MOBA, which is Dota 2, which we started off with running the lowest options in the 900p resolution, as apparently this is how a lot of people tend to play the game. We saw 95 FPS on average even throughout a full game playing, although I would add I'm not exactly a Dota player. I did give the game a test with the high settings just to make it fair, and we saw 47 FPS on average but with worse frame times, due to some of the effects taking more of a toll on the CPU, which is really a limit in a game like Dota 2, which doesn't tend to play too nicely with these Core 2 quads, but it's not too unplayable and you would get away with playing it. Realistically though, I'd stick to lower settings, as that'd probably work out your best bet overall. Standalone benchmarks that just ran optimally at the highest settings include Minecraft with the fancy options, which ran incredibly smoothly up until you needed to load some chunks in, which is really just due to the CPU, and it would slow right down to about 8 FPS, and sometimes even worse purely due to the heavy loads on the CPU during this time, which is once again a limiting factor. Overall it wasn't exactly off-putting, as realistically if you grew up playing the game on CPUs like this, then you're sort of used to this happening. Elite Dangerous defaulted to the 900p resolution with the preset high options, so I just went along with it, despite the fact game telling me it wouldn't actually run on this machine. But testament to the game's optimizations, it ran nicely throughout, and I was able to escape a giant star thing that was going to blow me up and end up in a fight, and then land in some sort of space station, so you get the idea. Elite Dangerous seems to work in all its complexities. And then finally we have Skyrim, which ran at a solid 50 FPS on average while running with the high option selected in the 900p resolution, which looked alright and was definitely not an issue for a system like this. There were definitely a couple of drops here or there, and overall Skyrim made for a good experience. I captured this footage via my Elgato because I accidentally put the system away, but the captures still show exactly what the performance is. It just lacks the MSI Afterburner overlay, as that never plays nice with external capture software. As for Cloudgate, we scored a combined 7,037 with the graphics score coming in at around 13,412, which isn't too bad, but then again the CPU side performance was only 2,462, which isn't a great mismatch, but generally in most gaming titles we saw, which were GPU intensive, they ran okay. But the CPU is definitely a limiting factor with a build like this, and is exactly something I'll be touching on in my conclusion. Real-world tasks like your general usage and everything like that is absolutely fine, as you'd expect. Discord, everything like that works absolutely fine. I would add that Discord and modern gaming on a PC like this is a no-go, as the performance just tanks due to it eating up all the RAM and actually using quite a bit of CPU time to process voice functions and loading in stuff like that. Most basic tasks in the background are absolutely fine though, and in fact I even had to go streaming and editing on this PC. And this is how it turned out, with some edited footage, which was surprisingly decent on the PC. I'm not going to claim it's an editing machine, but you can get away with making a few highlights in something like Vegas, and here's a little example of what it ended up looking like after I'd streamed, downloaded the footage, and edited it up on this machine.
I could only ever eat fridge magnets since birth. My parents told me it was the only thing that could sustain me.
Fridge
Little
magnet?
did I know.
Is that where the
Fridge
magnet I bought from Rome went? You know, the one with like the Triforce of the popes? Do you remember, I bought a magnet in Rome and it had the 3 previous popes, and in the middle it had them summoning the new pope.
The final pope.
So in conclusion, a cheap £38 PC, and do I actually recommend it? Well, no, not really at all, and that's sort of why I made this video. People keep harking on at me to do a 775 PC because you can fit them into a sub £40 budget. And yes, you can. But look at the poor value this PC has offered us compared to the 1155 alternative that doesn't really cost much more, as shown by the SFF PC I did a little while ago. Yes, this is an option if you can't afford to stretch your budget up maybe £10 or £15 more to about 50 to 60 quid. But the performance increase you'd see, well, even on the CPU side alone, it just shows that a PC like this is only an option if you're on such a tight budget that you can't increase it. It's worth noting that the deals I got on this PC weren't even spectacular, as realistically, you could see this PC ending up costing around sub £30 if you looked hard enough. But that's not the point of this PC. You guys wanted to see what you can do with about £35 to £40 with an esports PC on the 775 system. And it's okay, the 775 experience will get you by, and I'll probably look into upgrading this PC and checking out the Core 2 quads in more detail in the future, but in the meantime, just to recap, if this is all you can afford, then no, it's not a bad option, it's a decent PC, and I was using it for well over a week just to get by. But if you can afford to save up just a tiny bit more cash to get an old Dell or HP Pru-built on the Core i5-2400 or the Core i3-2120 series, which are extremely common, then it'd be much better to go down that route and stick in a low-powered graphics card. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this video has been somewhat helpful and at least given some of those on the lower end of the market something to target, and maybe change some of your guys' minds about saving up a tiny bit more and getting something a tiny bit better. Thank you very much for watching. Good night. So I hope this has given a viable build option to some of you that need it, and possibly changed a few people's minds on whether or not they need to build it. Of course, you can check out the rest of the highlights on the secondary channel, or like and subscribe for more content just like this.